Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Utah's leaders attract national attention as they weigh in on potential impeachment witnesses. The 2020 legislative session begins with a repeal of the controversial tax reform law. New polling shows what Utahns think about state and national leaders, and Governor Herbert delivers his final State of the State address. Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have former State House Representative Sophia DeCaro, Doug Wilkes, editor of the Deseret News, and Representative Brian King, House Minority Leader. So glad to have you here with us today. So much happening nationally and locally in politics. I want to go to one big issue and start with you, Doug, on the impeachment proceedings in Washington, D.C. The reality is the eyes of the nation are on our own Senator Mitt Romney, sort of the eye of the hurricane right now. Full-page articles taken out against him. Jimmy Kimmel talking about him on late night TV. Talk about the position he's in and why so many people are following.
The interesting thing is people know who Mitt Romney is, right? He said he wanted to be a voice of conscience as it relates to the electorate. He's been very critical of Donald Trump. On the other hand, he's been supportive of those positions that Donald Trump takes that he wants to get behind. So government is transactional right now. It's less based on relationships than it used to be. And Mitt Romney has said, you know, he wants to hear from witnesses. Looks like that's not happened, but people want to hear what he has to say.
Representative King, so talk about what people are wanting to have happen, because we don't know. That vote will happen soon. We'll see if it goes one way or the other. How has Mitt Romney positioned himself? How are people feeling about this? Because he'd probably be one vote for calling witnesses,
right,
or at least one.
Right, he's indicated that. And I think that's the right vote in the sense that I think people deserve and want to have as much information as possible. You've gotten information coming to light recently about John Bolton, what he's going to say in his book. Well, we're going to find out really quickly what John Bolton has to say, but if he's not called as a witness in this proceeding, we're never going to find out in a position to act on the information that he provides, and that's problematic for people, and it should be problematic for people.
Okay, so Sophia, talk about the Republicans, the state, nationally here too. What are they looking from Mitt Romney? All right, if he does vote to call a witness, are there ramifications for him? Let's talk about locally.
Yeah, so I think, of course, there's not going to be, I think there will be general support. I mean, we need to have at least a perception that the Senate is doing their due diligence, and I don't think he will be faulted for that. I think there's support for him in wanting to act on his conscience, and I think that's a positive. Of course, I do think he'll probably get some negative ramifications from that decision as well, but I think the general population will be supportive of him wanting to lead with his conscience if that's trying to, you know, help the Senate do the due diligence.
So do you think that means people will not think he's breaking ranks with the party? Is just voting his conscience, as you said, or is?
Well, like I said, I do think he will probably get some pushback from certain elements of the party, of course, but I think the general population will. I think that will ease over time.
Yeah.
You know, Jason, I don't think there'll be that many ramifications. Even with Mitch McConnell just wants to win. Once he wins, he'll go on to the next thing. Donald Trump just wants to win in his space. If he can take senators that will help him, great. If they won't help him the next day, he may castigate them. So this is how Washington is working today, and I don't think it's going to have much of an impact.
I think it's remarkable the degree to which the Republican Party has become the party of Trump. And partly that's his personality. I don't think we've ever seen a president who is as willing to really castigate, to go after someone who breaks ranks from him personally. And this president has done that. And I think, quite honestly, people are fearful of his ability to cause base voters within that particular party to turn on any dissenters in a way that, at times, really causes those people who may be inclined to want to think about dissenting from becoming fearful and falling in line. I don't think it's good for the policy and the direction of the country, but I think it's the reality of what we're dealing with today's Republican Party.
I want to talk for a second about that policy policy of the country and where people are on this issue. As we know, the last few days, these senators have been able to submit questions. And you can tell a lot about what they're thinking and where they're leaning by the questions themselves. And I'm just wanting to kind of get to what might happen. So let's just say there is a vote and the president is acquitted by the Senate. And one of the questions from Mitt Romney I'd like to read to you and tell us what you think might be hidden in here, whether there might be a combination of things that may be declared after the vote. This is from Senator Mitt Romney in one of the 6 questions that he asked on Thursday. He said, how do we consider abuse of power if the president had more than one motive for his alleged conduct, such as the pursuit of personal political advantage, rooting out corruption, and the promotion of national interests? That's very interesting. So, Doug, somehow it's like, hey, maybe there's a personal interest in here, but there's a national interest. So,
I mean, there is, with this impeachment, is there a smoking gun? So on the Democratic side particularly, people say, look, clearly Donald Trump misbehaved. Clearly he shouldn't have done a quid pro quo. Was it in fact a quid pro quo when the money was released? Well, the money wasn't released until people found out he was engaged in this conversation. So I think that question simply speaks to, look, very rarely is something black and white, and here you have different conversations going on, but you had pressure clearly being done. Those in the diplomatic corps, it's more than one person saying, hey, we felt this pressure, there are things going on. Yeah. And then at the end of the day, do you need to hear Bolton? If in fact you say, yeah, this was wrong, and I don't think he should be removed from office. And that's the calculation the Republicans are making.
Yeah. Well, that's what Lamar Alexander said.
Yeah,
he said,
That's exactly
this is wrong, but it's not impeachable.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things about Senator Romney's question that's important is when the President of the United States or any elected official, and it's true for Representative DeCaro, former Representative DeCaro and I, when we swore our oath here at the Utah State Legislature, we swear undivided loyalty to the Constitution of the United States and to the people that we represent. This is not a balancing of interests that we're asked to undertake when we get elected to office. Undivided loyalty is what we are required to give. Now, being human beings, there's that you know, realistically, there are mixed motives that come into play sometimes, but the aspiration, the intent, the desire, the need for us as elected officials to act with undivided loyalty, critically important for us to keep in mind at all times.
Sophia, you have something, because I want to ask you a question about that.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult, you know, as we discussed, it's going to be hard to narrow in. Was there a crime done, and what was the intent? There's a lot of gray space on what the intention was. I mean, you could argue, and there are people who are arguing that, you know, if Biden did do something wrong, should the president not look into that, and could that not be the intent, just to, you know, look into if something in fact was being done wrong? So I think that's what is going to hang up the process, and is being able to make that a black and white assumption on what that intent was.
To this black and white assumption, take what Representative King was saying as the truth is, when someone takes the oath of office, and you did when you were represented, this undivided loyalty. How does one keep that? How did you, when ultimately all these decisions are sort of run through a political filter?
Yeah, you really just, you have to remember why you're there, what you're doing. Let your core conscience guide that for you as much as possible. And you know, you are bound by certain processes and procedures that are in place, and that's what we're seeing here. We're following a process and procedure that's been set in place in these institutions, and that's what's going to end up guiding the outcome on this.
I do think, though, there is a political calculation. There is on the federal government and in the state government. You know, is your district red or is your district blue? Are you up for election this year or not? If you're not running for re-election, which we saw with Senator Flake, he went all in. I asked him personally, could you say what you're saying if you were running? He said, no, I couldn't. So, I mean, that was quite an admission. And, you know, you'd like to see both Democrats and Republicans keep that kind of ethic you just talked about. But even in the state legislature, it's an election year of the state, and maybe that's why we're not having tax reform.
Well, there's an element of that. There's no doubt, Jason, that politics has an influence on what we do as elected officials. But the overriding principles that should be guiding us as much as possible is good public policy, fidelity to the state and the federal, most importantly, the federal Constitution. And I think that if you're acting in good faith to try to reconcile, synthesize those competing considerations in the best way that you can, keeping in mind the aspiration to do the right thing for the right reasons, that's all we can ask for from our elected officials. And I think personally, there's a big gap between where we should be and where we are when we look at the Chief Executive Officer of the United States of America.
Oh, I was, and interestingly, Romney is protected. Senator Romney is not going to be up for election for some time now, so he does have some safety in putting himself out there.
He does, but maybe that brings up a point, because I'm curious about one of your colleagues, Representative King. So Representative Tim Quinn has a bill for this session that allows Utahns to call back a senator. It's a pretty high bar, 25% of active voters. That's over 300,000 signatures. Is that a result of what we're seeing in Washington, D.C.? Maybe, I mean, it's a conspiracy theory on that one.
You talk to Tim, and Tim says it has nothing to do with Senator Romney, because he says, this has been in the hopper for some time, and I don't doubt Representative Quinn on that. He's a good friend. But I do think that there are people that are concerned. Some of Senator Romney's behavior toward Donald Trump in the minds of many Republicans particularly causes them a great amount of heartburn. And I think that bill of Representative Quinn's may get some traction because of what people have in their mind about Senator Romney.
But it's House Bill 217, as I recall, and we editorialized in the Deseret News today not in favor of that, because one, you don't want to keep putting people in an election cycle. You don't want policy to drive pulling someone out of office. You pull them out of office through policy in the election. That's why we have the elections. And unless there's malfeasance, unless there's some reason for them, they've done something wrong, they've embezzled money, whatever it is, and you want them out, well, there are provisions in the Senate to then discipline them and remove them from the Senate. So I don't think you necessarily need this measure, because it does seem to further politicize and weaponize the electorate.
I have a tendency to agree with Doug.
Well, and I think this is just a consequence of timing. I think this was a timing issue. The legislature has contemplated the 17th Amendment provision in the Constitution before, when the legislature would elect the Senate, the United States Senator for the state. Right. And I think this just happens to be a little bit of a consequence in the timing rather than the conspiracy angle.
Can I also say one thing? Senator Lee's been deeply involved in this. So both of Utah's senators have been deeply engaged in what's happening in Washington right now, which I think is actually good. The electorate can say, well, do we like what they're doing or not? And the electorate can rule on that in the vote. But Senator Lee's helping President Trump as they talk about impeachment, but he's also coming out very strongly against or dealing with the War Powers Act and the responsibility of Congress. Right. So I do think we have two people in Washington who are trying to do the right thing, and then it's up to the voters whether they want that to be or not. If the Democrats have a better way, then you put that forward. But I do like that they're engaged. I see less political calculation by both of them. They're both able to put themselves out there, and I think for Utahns, that's a good thing. Yeah,
it's interesting as we move to this next topic, just how many times the Utah thoughts are relevant on the national stage. People do care about what we have to say in Utah. Just a side note. Let's talk about the governor, who had also some things to say about the state of Utah. His last State of the State address was given this week. Sophia, anything you saw in there that kind of caught your attention, really thought was impactful?
Well, it was kind of emotional, because knowing that this was his last speech to the his last legislative session, in fact, and I kind of felt he was being a little bit humble in all of the accomplishments he's made throughout the years, but lots of focus on the economy, on assistance to rural Utah. He's always been a cheerleader for education. That came out strongly. I thought what was very touching was just the way he communicated directly to the people, and that just exemplifies the kind of person he is. I think it was a great speech.
Mm-hmm. Doug, let's talk about a couple of these issues. He mentioned the economy. No doubt about it. The state of Utah is doing well. We're like 7% personal income growth, the second highest in the country, like 2.3% unemployment. These are pretty important things for us.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been hearing the same kind of speech for many years. The economy's done very well. Utah's benefited greatly. Silicon Slopes is doing very well. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg is there today, speaking gubernatorial debate today out there. But there's a lot of factors that go into that. And I think Republicans and Democrats alike have a strong work ethic and are both focused on education and the things that are important to the state. There's work to be done. But my thoughts go to what about the next 10 years? Because we are on a cycle. The economy is cyclical, whether whomever's in the office. And there are going to be challenges ahead, and I'm glad we have a bit of a buffer financially.
Representative, one of the things he talked about, which seems to be something a few Republicans are talking about, is the environment. Talk about some of the things he said there, and maybe is this becoming a sort of a bipartisan issue?
Well, I don't think there's any question that what you just said is true, Jason. We've had now for several years a bipartisan Clean Air Caucus. I think Representative DeCaro was probably a part of that when she was in the legislature. And I think both Republicans and Democrats have recognized for some time up in the legislature about the economic impact of these kinds of issues, as well as the obvious importance of environment for its own sake. We all need to breathe clean air, and we all need to have clean access to clean water. So those are things that, fortunately, in Utah, more so than on the national level, you've got the ability and the willingness and the experience in the past of having Democrats and Republicans working together in a way that benefits Utah. And so I'm grateful for Governor Herbert. I think he's been the governor during this remarkable run of economic growth for Utah. And it's not completely because he's the governor, of course, nobody thinks that, but it's not completely disassociated with him either. And I think that Utah's been lucky, quite honestly, to have him as the governor in many ways. One thing that I have always given him credit for, and I will give his predecessors, Republican and Democratic governors who were predecessors, credit for, is they have ensured that the people that are chosen for the judiciary, Supreme Court justices and district court judges in this state, have been really high quality individuals who were well qualified regardless of political orientation, regardless of ideological orientation, and Utah has benefited from it. And we have a reputation across the country among all the states for having an extraordinarily high-quality judiciary.
And I think there are, excuse me, Sophia, but I think clean air and the environment has come to the top of the list. The governor wanted nearly $100 million in there. They want to put electric car stations so you can get all the way through the end of the state. You have a mayor of Salt Lake City now who's said everything will be done through the lens of clean air. You have Ben McAdams who's focused on this back in Washington. So there's absolutely a realization that for every reason, particularly good health, but also for the economy, people want to come here if the air is clean. They won't want to come here if it's dirty.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, and what's great about this is, we've already seen an improvement. A 30% improvement was cited, and that's not sufficient for the state of Utah. So, it's great because it's part of the culture to be proactive in this and addressing this. And what's great is that even though there has been improvement, that's not good enough. We want it to be better. We want a better quality of life, and we're going to put the policies in place to make that happen.
Your colleague Natalie Gochner here at the University of Utah with the Kempf C. Gardner Policy Institute, they've provided a roadmap now under the legislature's direction.
And it is a great roadmap.
And so now there is some clarity for all of us to follow.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get into these policies as they translate into legislation, because we're 1 week into the legislative session now. Representative King, tell us what the flavor is sort of the session. Sometimes when we approach, there's like a big issue or something we're going to tackle, but have we seen that yet? What do you think what it's going to be?
Before earlier this week, it was tax reform and whether we were going to repeal and how we were going to deal with the referendum likely getting on the ballot in November. With the decision by the leaders of the legislature to repeal tax reform, that's sort of taken the air out of that balloon. I don't think you're going to see, so it's the potential story that I think will end up being quite a non-story, because I don't think that leaders of the legislature are going to want to tackle that issue again. And so we move on to other things. We've talked about clean air. The governor, as Doug mentioned, had a proposal for $100 million on clean clean air and other environmental issues, which I think would be great to see. The problem is that that money has to come out of the general fund, and we're still dealing with these structural balance issues.
So explain that a bit, because our education fund's up $100 million.
Yeah.
The general fund is down.
So the education fund is funded entirely by income tax. Income tax growth over the last year has been very good. People talk about a surplus. It's just a surplus on what we projected 6, 8, 10, 12 months ago. So we do have more money coming in than we projected, but we still don't have enough money in that education fund from income tax to fully fund both public and higher education. We're still taking money out of the general fund. The general fund is funded primarily by sales tax, which has not, it's been growing, but it's not been growing as quickly as the education fund income tax revenue. So this structural imbalance, we still need to address the fact that we're constrained, relatively speaking, by the revenue that's available in the general fund to fund all these things, including such things as the $100 million that the governor wants for environmental issues. So we got to address this. It's not going to happen in this session, but in the next year or two, it will happen.
Well, that will be interesting to watch. Is what components might be addressed. You know, they tried to deal with it in one big giant fell sweep, but maybe it's better to handle some of these things incrementally. There were a lot of good things in that tax bill that the general public would likely support. It will be interesting to see if there will be appetite to maybe handle a little bit of those and do that incrementally.
Mm-hmm. So, Doug, that's an interesting point, because you have a Democrat here talking about the structural imbalance needs to be fixed right away. Both sides of the aisle kind of get into this. When are they going to?
You put me in the middle. So.
Yes, that's why you're there right there. So talk about that.
I think from the voter point of view, it's frustrating to say there's such urgency with tax reform, such urgency we're going to have a special session. Good news, we've passed it, but the public didn't accept it. And the food tax was part of that. Messaging was a part of that. So to now say, okay, we're going to have a 45-day legislative session, we're going to repeal it, and we're not going to touch it. So why not a cynic, or maybe if I'm a media cynic, I guess I am. Everyone's up for re-election. You don't want to go down that path during an election. Okay, well, now you go another year. Yeah. Utah's in a good place financially. I think that's legitimate. But if this is a key issue, I wish they would debate it now while everyone's here.
I would agree with that. I mean, we have to remember the legislature constitutionally, their job is to pass bills, enact law, and to appropriate a budget. This really falls under the responsibility of the legislative body. And so it would be interesting, you know, to see if it does get kicked down the can or not handled.
It does need to be addressed. The problem is, from the leadership perspective, they feel that they've been bit twice now. At the end of the last session in 2019, there was a bunch of backlash. We had the special session, huge backlash in the form of the referendum. So I think it's more likely than not that what you'll see is it will be tackled because it has to be tackled at some point. But I agree with Doug, it doesn't need to be tackled in this session. We're going through a relatively robust economic growth period. I think that you'll see the next governor into the 2021 and 2022 sessions, that governor is going to have to deal with this issue, and those legislatures are going to have to deal with this issue.
Yes, very true. Any other bills you're watching this session that we should really know about? Things you're going to capture the attention. Doug, what are you watching?
Well, I think education is always key. How are they going to fund education? We personally are very interested in clean air, so we're going to see how much money is given to clean air. There's some smaller bills like daylight saving time.
That's back again.
If they pass that
every year, 4
states have to agree to it. It is, but see, you think nationally there might be some motivation there. So there's those types of things. But this session, from a media point of view, doesn't really have a stamp on it yet. So we'll see. We'll see what rises.
Okay. It's an election year, and so there are going to be some issues that people use as wedge issues to want to talk about. There are going to be a couple of abortion bills, I'm sure, at least, and maybe more. I've got an op-ed this morning in the Deseret News that talks about our perspective as Democrats on that. We're going to be talking about it one way or the other. Let's talk about it in a way that doesn't drive people to their corners prematurely. Let's talk about it based on facts and reasonable discussion, and I think that we can find common ground on some of these things.
Okay. I want to just end with a poll that we just did with the Deseret News, with the Hinckley Institute of Politics and the Deseret News about the governor's race. Because what you said is right. All these decisions are going to land on the desk of the next governor. And these are not small issues. So I want to talk about this. Maybe Doug, you can go through a couple of these numbers with it for just a minute. So in this poll, the people were asked who they would support for governor, and we drilled down into the Republicans who are going to show up for that primary. And they said, I'm very likely I'm Republican and I'm going to show up. And so the numbers were these. Jon Huntsman, 33%. Spencer Cox, 25%. Jeff Birmingham, 5%. Greg Hughes, 3%. Thomas Wright, 3%. And Amy Winder Newton, 2%, with a 25% don't know. That's a little bit of a change over the last couple of weeks in terms of this polling.
It's a little bit of a change, and that you certainly see the front runners. There's a strong name recognition. We spoke to those at the lower end, and they're saying, yeah, a lot of people are undecided. There's also this question of how many Democrats will, for the primary, switch over to Republicans so they can have a voice. Yeah. Because in our state, it's with all due respect, hard for Democrats to have the voice. And a two-party system has value and benefit, and you want to put forth good candidates. So I think it's early. I think now people will start to pay attention. So there's a measure of hope for those who are on the lower end, if they can get out to the different districts and convince people that they're the person, vote for something different. But clearly, Cox and Huntsman, they're in the forefront for people who typically vote.
Yeah, they certainly seem to be. When you're running for office, Sophia, so how did you try to capture that other group? So you have people, the Republican Democrats, they seem to know their candidates, and in this case, we see them pretty well. But how do you capture that other group and say you need to engage? Because there are a lot of unaffiliated voters in Utah.
Yeah, well, that's very, very difficult to try to do the targeted outreach. But you have to just pick up one voter at a time, and and do your best to target that population. It'll be interesting. I believe it's still a bit early, still very early for this gubernatorial race and what we're going to be seeing over the next few months. But it is exciting.
Yeah. So in the last couple seconds, Representative King, a Democrat talking to these Republicans, what should they focus on?
Well, look, I mean, I think you should focus on somebody who is principled and pragmatic. And if you have somebody who's going to be principled and pragmatic, that's about as much as we can hope for.
Okay, we'll watch for it. Thank you for your comments today. So insightful.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. The show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.